Hey guys, Eej right here, and today I'm going to be talking about a band that I've talked about quite heavily on this channel already. I am going to be doing a Green Day worst to best. Now, they have 13 studio albums if you include the trilogy as all separate entities, which I would say they are. Green Day is one of my favorite bands. Despite my negative review of their most recent album and my kind of mixed reviews of some of their more recent projects altogether, overall I think they were one of the most consistent bands of the 90s and early 2000s. I think after American Idiot things got a bit bumpy for my personal liking, but I will say that all the 90s albums, American Idiot, and even like albums that from some of their more recent ones I do quite enjoy, so I decided I would take a stab and rank all these albums. Out of all 13, one of them has to come in at rock bottom. Coming in at number 13 is Father of All, released this year, is by far their worst album in my opinion. Not only is it so out of the blue for them, it's just such a disappointing album. I quite like when artists change up their sound. A lot of my favorite artists have changed up their sound over the years, and I greatly appreciate that. I have almost no problem with that whatsoever. However, Green Day's direction that they went on this album is not new, it's not fresh, and it's not exciting. They took many of the old ideas from classic rock, glam rock, alt rock, and watered it down to a hollow shell of what they usually are, leaving us with a really short, really uninspired sounding album. Now sure, there are some tracks on here that I guess you could say grow on you, they're catchy, whatever, but for the most part, there's nothing memorable, there's nothing unique about this album. There's nothing that impressive. The production is horrendous. It's so overly compressed and such weirdly tight sounding that everything sounds dry. Billy's vocals, he tries to experiment with new vocal styles on here, and I think that's perfectly fine. However, the actual execution of these experiments was absolutely unlistenable in some spots, with some horrendous backing vocals, some horrible melodies that kept on popping up time and time again. Half of these songs sound like they could be in an iPod or a car commercial, and that's not really a compliment. Green Day needs to go in a new direction, but the direction they went on this one was not the right one. Not only was the content of this album bad, the promotion behind it, they kind of are really digging into that whole boomer energy here. They don't feel like this young, inspired band anymore. It's really clear that they're pandering to an aging rock audience. So at the end of the day, if one album has to be at rock bottom at number 13, I would say it's Father of All. Coming in second to last at number 12 is Dose from 2012, from the right in the middle of the trilogy. The trilogy gets a lot of hate, and understandably so. I will say that the trilogy is not as bad as people make it out to be, and is definitely not their worst. But I will say that out of all the albums in the trilogy, Dose is by far probably the least interesting, and overall just the worst. At the very least, unlike Father of All, this album at least has an identity. There was a clear direction they wanted to go, and it still has that Green Day sound to it. And keep in mind, when I'm saying Green Day sound, I'm not saying that it sounds like the old Green Day I like. I mean, it has a lot of the key features that are in the core of Green Day music. Billy's vocals, Billy's writing, all of it's on top of the game here, even if I'm not that proud of the end product. Obviously, this album has some duds that are usually claimed to be some of Green Day's worst material. Obviously, the song Nightlife is a classic one that is obviously hated in the community, although I think people have come around to it quite a bit. Needless to say, unlike Father of All, this album does have a sense of direction. It's just, once again, this direction is not that well executed. Much like the rest of the albums in the trilogy, the production is a bit all over the place, and unlike Father of All, where it's heavily compressed, Dose has a very thin sound to it. Most of the tracks on here do come off as being very filler tracks. There are a few standouts to me. Stray Heart is a really good one, in my opinion. I really like the bass behind that. That's a good example of them experimenting with the new sound and actually executing it well. However, on songs like Lady Cobra, on songs like Nightlife, they really come off very all over the place, and they did not execute this as well in those spots. That is why Dose comes in at number 12. Coming in at number 11 is Trey is an album that I actually quite enjoy, and it kind of hurts putting it this low, but when I compare it to the rest of the albums in their discography, with the exception of the previous two that I mentioned, it does look a lot, it's very lackluster. A Little Boy Named Train, Brutal Love are all songs that I quite enjoy. X-Kid, in my opinion, is one of the best from the entire trilogy. Out of all the albums in the trilogy, I would say Trey has the most throwback feel to the 2000s era with American Idiot. However, I would say the production, once again, on these trilogy albums is lacking heavily, definitely taking away from some of the song quality. However, I will say the production is a step up from Dose. I do think the track list is a bit more full of good songs. 99 Revolutions, X-Kid, Brutal Love, all these songs are songs I quite enjoy. Like Dose, like Father of All, a lot of the songs in here come off as filler, a lot of these songs come off as forgettable, and it's hard ranking this that high. But rounding off the top 10 at number 10 is Uno is the highest ranking one from the trilogy, and this one would have definitely ranked at least 2 or 3 spots higher a few years ago, but as this album has aged, it has diminished on me quite a bit. Not only is the sound design on this album just very basic, I do appreciate the throwback to the more 90s sound on songs like Nuclear Family, which is one of my favorites from the trilogy. I'm glad that they were going out of their way to revisit that era of their discography, an era that I quite enjoy. However, it doesn't come off as authentic as I would like it, and instead comes off as them just trying to revisit their youth and not executing it as well as I wish they would. This album does make the top 10. It ranks higher than 3 other albums, so there is a few positives to say here. Compared to the rest of the albums on the trilogy, I would say that the writing is much better, much stronger here. I think overall this album has the least amount of filler. However, even the good songs are not some of Green Day's best. Strangely enough, despite all these albums being around the same length in the trilogy, Uno does feel like the longest, and I get the most out of listening to it. If I were ranking these in perspective, this would rank a good amount higher than Trey. However, compared to the other albums, I feel like this one was a bit of a step back. Despite it being the most interesting on the trilogy, with some of the biggest bangers on the album, and some songs that actually sound great live, I just really think that it has not aged too well, and just kind of reminds me of some middle-aged dudes trying to reminisce on their old days. Coming in at number 9, I'll probably get some slack for this one, but 21st Century Breakdown. 21st Century Breakdown is an album that I've come around to a good amount since I first heard it. I actually strongly disliked it when I first heard it. I thought it was really corny for them to go this path, because even though I liked American Idiot, what first struck me was that 21st Century Breakdown seemed just like a cash grab, like they were following up the last rock opera with an even bigger rock opera with more actual opera elements to it, much more extravagant production, less straightforward. And while I think that the story and message behind this album still holds up today, I think it is a good album. Some parts have actually grown on me quite a bit. I will say that there are more songs on here than I enjoy than I previously did. Static Age is increasingly becoming one of my favorites from this album. Horseshoes and Hand Grenades is a great banger. The ballad 21 Guns, despite it not being my favorite Green Day single out there, and it does feel like the second Boulevard of Broken Dreams, it is still a solid track. Overall, this album is hard to rank any lower than this, because the trilogy and Father of All are definitely a lot less focused, a lot less organized than this album is. However, I also have a hard time ranking this any higher, because this, in my opinion, is filled with a lot of filler. It's very bloated, and I do think that these songs don't all age as well as others. I also will say that I do have some issues with the aesthetic of the band during this era. I feel like they were heavily playing into some of that whole Hot Topic stuff that was going on at the time. If that was intentional or not, they kind of fell right in there. But at the end of the day, the actual messages behind this album, the actual end product, is much better than I originally thought. I still feel that a lot of these songs, at their core, are not that great, and they use the extravagant production and layers to boost up the song's quality artificially. It's hard to hate this album, but it's also hard for me to love it. Coming in at number 8 is where we get to the point where I actually start genuinely thoroughly enjoying most of these albums quite a lot. And coming in at number 8 is Revolution Radio is my highest ranking album of theirs that came after American Idiot, even above 21st Century Breakdown. While a lot of this album does feel, once again, like they were trying to return to the American Idiot era, there are some great songs on here. Bang Bang is one of Green Day's greatest songs in their entire career, and I think it's one of their best singles that they've ever released. The song Revolution Radio does play heavily into their pop-punk sound, but it is executed quite well. And the duo between Somewhere Now opening it up and Forever Now pretty much closing it, with the exception of Ordinary World, is a really great multi-part song, which I think they executed very well. And perhaps one of my personal favorites on this entire album is the song Troubled Times. A good statement on the state of society in general, and I will say that it still holds up, and I think it will hold up because it's written in a way that is timeless. However, for a lot of the good songs on here, there are a few that I just cannot stand. And not in a way that they're so repulsive that I just can't listen to them, but when I'm in the mood to Green Day, these are not the songs I'm listening to. Still Breathing is a song that was tremendously popular from this album, at least in the alternative rock scene. It's, to me, Green Day playing to their core strengths, writing a song that they know is going to be a hit for the teenagers, and unfortunately it just doesn't ring with me that well. The song Ordinary World could be much better, however, I just feel like, once again, it plays into that very corny pop side that they really want to get something big out of this album, and it's just, I don't think Billy pulled it off as great as he did with Time of Your Life nearly 2 decades earlier. And there are a few songs on here that I do think are a bit more filler. Say Goodbye, for example, Bouncing Off the Walls. But even those songs, they aren't the most excruciating to listen to, unlike some of the songs off their most recent album. Coming in at number 7 is Warning. It's kind of a joke on the Reddit. On the Green Day subreddit, people say it's underrated and it's kind of become a meme at this point. And even though it is the lowest ranking album from their first 7, it does not mean it's a bad album at all. It's actually really hard for me to rank these next few because I like them all pretty equally. I think that Warning, however, does have the least amount of memorable tracks and the least memorable sound of these albums. I really appreciate Green Day's introduction to having more acoustic guitars in their sound. I do think that the production of these guitars is a bit thin throughout and does kind of drag the quality down a bit, but songwriting-wise, they were on top of their game. Minority is definitely one of my favorite Green Day songs. Another song on this album that is one of my favorites, without a doubt, is Macy's Day Parade. I think Macy's Day Parade is one of their most impactful, more acoustic ballads in their entire career. I think lyrically its statements are really drive it home. Even some of the deeper cuts on this album, I quite enjoy a lot. I like the weird Misery song that's so out of the blue for Green Day, but it just works so well. I think where Green Day was at this point in their career was they were down on the downward slope in popularity. They probably figured that after this album they weren't going to ever reach the fame they had before, so they were willing to experiment a bit more. Little did they know American Idiot was going to be so successful that to this day they're still like in the pop stratosphere. But Warning would have been a good natural progression into the next phase of their career if they did lose popularity as time went on. Coming in at number 6 is Insomniac. To me, out of these 3 albums, of Insomniac, Nimrod, and Warning, has the most cohesive sound throughout. It's pretty heavy, one of their heaviest albums to date. It pretty much takes the element of Dookie and gets it more aggressive, with more dirtier sounding guitars, more aggressive lyrics, and singing. Well, I feel like this album is a slight bit disappointing following a practically flawless album like Dookie. To expect them to follow that up with another perfect album would be unrealistic. Obviously, this album is buoyed by Brain Stew, but to me, I've always preferred Jaded. The song Stewart in the Avenue is one of my favorite Green Day songs with one of Mike's best bass lines, and honestly, Walking Contradiction and Geek Stink Breath are some of their best singles in their entire career. I personally have always liked this style of Green Day more, the more young, aggressive, and snotty side of them, more than some of the more newer and more professional side. That's just my personal preference. However, I will say that this album, it does start off a bit shaky, but as the album progresses, it gets really strong, and is a solid piece of punk music, arguably their most heavy, hardcore type album in their entire career. Oh, don't get me wrong, this is not a hardcore punk album in the slightest, but there is a lot of heavy production, heavy guitars on here, and this album, it really makes this album stand out in their discography. And coming after a big album like Dookie, obviously I don't think it's as great as Dookie, but it's a good follow-up, and it really was the album that said, hey, these guys are more than just a one-hit wonder album or whatever. They're going to have a career ahead of them, and if it wasn't for Insomniac, they probably wouldn't be here today. Rounding off the top 5 at number 5 is Nimrod is arguably their most diverse album to date, with songs ranging from really fast, very 80s inspired hardcore punk, to their usual pop punk, to some ska with actual trumpets, to like a slow, stonery surf song. I think that this album is full of great songs that are very underappreciated. Uptight might just be my favorite on here. I just think that this album is full of gems. There are a lot of songs on here, though, where their experimentation doesn't pay off as well as I would have liked, unfortunately. I will say that the most of the tracks on here are really good and some of their best in their entire career. The writing on this album, to me, is some of Billy's best. Obviously, this has the big hit, Time of Your Life, Good Riddance. However, I think that song isn't even one of the greatest on the album. I feel that in the grand scheme of things, people underestimate how risky of a move this album actually was. In the public eye, most people haven't even really heard the Lookout albums that they did before Dookie, so most people only were aware of Dookie and Insomniac, two relatively straightforward, more punk-sounding albums. And even though this album tricks the listener by opening up with a very Green Day-sounding Nice Guys Finish Last, it very quickly transitions into the many different genres and experiments that they decided to do just a few tracks in. And yet, despite the diversity on here, the big change in sound on a lot of these songs, Redundant being one of my favorite, this album was quite a success. It produced some hits, and I think it is one of their most influential albums in their career. Even though I don't think all the tracks really bring it home for me all the time, I greatly appreciate their experimentation on here. And all of these songs, despite experimenting with different genres, still have a Green Day feel to it, unlike Father of All or Dose. Even though these songs are very much out of the blue for Green Day, it still feels like Green Day, and that's what I like about this. Coming in at number 4 is a much less diverse album, but an album I quite like. It is Kerplunk. If you haven't already caught on, I'm definitely a big fan of Lookout Green Day, arguably the most. That's just my personal preference. But I genuinely think that Kerplunk is one of their most solid albums in their entire career. Now, the album is nowhere near as diverse musically as Nimrod or Warning or the Trilogy, but I will say that the way it is put together is almost flawless. I will say there are a few tracks on here that I'm not too crazy about, which puts it at number 4, but for the most part, the energy and passion put into each and every song on this album is phenomenal. The introduction of Trey Cool into the band on this record really makes a big shift right away. You really start to see his talent right off the bat. For some reason, I think that compared to their first album, the production is actually lackluster a little bit, but the actual songwriting, song quality actually makes up for it. Green Day's choruses, Green Day's verses, the actual songwriting behind this, the lyrics are great. The song No One Knows features one of Mike's best bass lines, one of the most melancholy sounding songs in their entire career, but it still has that very early, young, distorted sound. And the song Christie Road remains one of my favorite Green Day songs in their entire career. I love that song, and it's a great one when they do it live. It's no surprise this was the last album on a minor label, and almost immediately after they would be signed, and then Dookie would come out just a few years later. That's not surprising. This is a very, very, very well put together album from a band from the East Bay punk scene. I love East Bay punk. When you listen to all out of these albums, the quality and the writing isn't always quite there, but Green Day mastered it. Coming in at number 3 is arguably their most popular. American Idiot is usually put at number 1 or 2, and believe me, it's not that I like it any less, it's just my personal preference puts this at number 3. It's one of those albums where it's hard to actually say too much negative about it. This album influenced a whole generation of people, of kids, of musicians, and remains one of the most iconic albums of the 21st century. They mastered their craft here despite it being a pretty big shift in sound. Never before had they made a rock opera before, never before had they made 9-minute long songs. And the statement on the state of American politics at the time and society in general holds up way too accurate today, and I gotta say, it still rings true. The song Holiday is one of my favorite singles of theirs, and I think greatly represents what was happening then and what is happening now. One of the more deeper cuts on here that I quite enjoy is Give Me Novocaine. I really love the little hypnotic drum pattern with the acoustic guitars panning throughout. It's just a really well put together track with some of the most touching lyrics. And the story sense, this album is a bit all over the place. Some of these songs don't always match the story. Wake Me Up When September Ends is about Billy's dad. However, all the songs here fit. I'm not too crazy about the epic Homecoming. I think that one is a little bit more pieced together than Jesus of Suburbia. But at the end of the day, this whole album wraps up around What's Her Name, one of the greatest closers in music in general. The production to me still holds up phenomenally on here. I think despite it being heavily compressed, the actual heavy guitars, the drums, it just all drives home very well. It really gets the message across. This album to me is 2004 Society of America, really in a nutshell, and I think that it still holds up a bit too accurately today. And to this day, I don't think Green Day have been able to top it. Even though I think that the closest they got was Revolution Radio, that places quite a few spots down on this list. And unfortunately, I think Green Day has reached a stage in their career where I don't think they're going to necessarily top it. I mean, they've tried to recreate it, and it hasn't always worked out the best. But, yeah, I think that this is one of their greatest albums, and one of the greatest albums of the 21st century. Coming in at number 2 is Thirtynine Smooth. Let me just get this out of the way. Technically, it is not one of their best albums. From a musical standpoint, there's a lot of sloppiness going on here. The drumming from John Kiffmeyer, as much as I like it, it is not that professional. Even some of the guitar playing, despite it being some of his best guitar solos in his entire career, are also played a bit sloppily, and the structures are pretty conventional. But where this album gets me is just the raw passion, the raw energy, the raw excitement, the great lyrics throughout this thing. Not only are the lyrics very relatable, but they're very well written. I've heard a lot of relatable lyrics that are very cringy, but this one actually comes across as genuine. The song I Was There, actually written by John Kiffmeyer, is one of the best in their career, and the song Rest is arguably my favorite Green Day song. I love the more slow, sludgy, stonery vibes of that song. Even though I prefer this sound, I can understand why people wouldn't be as crazy about it. It's not as polished, it's not as complete sounding, but to me, what this album represents is everything the East Bay punk scene had been doing up to that point. It's a really well put together, really well executed, and arguably pretty well produced for it being their first album. It's everything I want in a Lookouts record in a nutshell. Oddly enough, despite him being very young here, I think Billy's vocals are some of the best they ever were on this album. Same with Mike. And albums like this really do show that Billy is a talented guitar player, even if he doesn't usually show off that much. But now that I got this little thing out of the way, with this being a personal favorite of mine, I think it's pretty clear, in my opinion, which one is number 1. Dookie. I know some people are probably tired of seeing this album at number 1 all the time, but for me, it's hard to say anything negative about this album, because quite frankly, it's one of the top 3 albums of all time, in my opinion, with almost nothing negative to say. Not only are all the songs very well crafted, the musicianship is really good here. People underestimate the talent of Trey Cool and Mike Dirnt on the bass and on drums, really driving this album, really driving it really strong. And Billy's writing is arguably the best it ever was here. Sure, these aren't great statements on society as much as they are more personal, introspective lyrics, but songs like Basket Case are still sung and relatable today. Songs like Coming Clean about him being bi are still very relevant today. And songs like Welcome to Paradise have some of the best lyrics in their entire career. Speaking of Welcome to Paradise and Longview, Mike Dirnt's bass lines here are phenomenal. In the bridge section of Welcome to Paradise is arguably one of the best parts of music of all time. The opening track, Burnout, really just, it's energy from the start, and Trey Cool really shows off with a great drum solo throughout that track. And even the closer of this, FOD, is it starts off with a very aggressive acoustic guitar, even if it's literally pretty far back in the mix. You still get the energy and passion from it, and then when it explodes at the end to round off this album, and then you wait, and then you get that little hidden track. This whole album is just pieced together perfectly with almost nothing bad to say about it. Sure, this album isn't as experimental and doesn't mess with different genres like Nimrod does, but they execute this genre perfectly. Any of these songs probably could have been cherry-picked as a single and would have been successful, but even the ones that they did pick remain classics to this day, and they still regularly play this album in full. So at the end of the day, Dookie to me is a masterpiece of not only Green Day's discography, but punk music in general. It's arguably the best album, in my opinion, that falls under any subcategory of punk music. It's perfectly executed with great lyrics, great musicianship, and great production. This whole thing's perfect to me. Well, with that being said, that's it for this video. I know some of these may be a bit controversial of takes, but this is just honestly my personal opinion, and that's about it for now. Goodbye.